The Tomb Kings, lost to the sands of time, buried beneath the destruction of the old world, entombed in... Okay, I've run out of metaphors, but it's safe to say that Tomb Kings are a forgotten faction. We still have characters hanging around such as Nagash, Rock and the Black, and we have a few nods towards them within the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, but the desert-based undead truly reside in the past. Unless, of course, you have Total War Warhammer, in which case it's spooky boys for days. But in this video, I hope to resurrect this lost army in the form of a Warhammer Underworlds Warband. I'll be using some of the models within this Gnarlwood set, which was very kindly sent to me by Games Workshop, as the basis for this conversion. Specifically, the Sons of Velmorn. I began with Helmar the Hewer, one of the 3 Grave Guard models within this warband. It made the most sense to base these 3 miniatures around the original Tomb Guard, but without trying to source the ever scarcer and ever more expensive Tomb King parts. I would have created more of a Tomb King inspired force, rather than a straight up copy of the originals. So with this in mind, my first task was to remove the parts required to build Helmar before cleaning up the pieces of any tabs and mold lines. A good bulk of the parts that would be used in this guide came from the Cypher Lords kit. While this warband is intended to be made up of followers of Chaos, a lot of the Tzeentchian aesthetic is clearly ancient Egyptian inspired. The banding on their crested masks is definitely reminiscent of the headdresses worn by the old Tomb King models, and their weaponry also follows suit. As such, this is an excellent kit to grab if you're looking to do some Tomb King inspired conversions. My first modification to Helmar would be replacing his axe with one of the Cypher Lord's swords. Now, a lot of people will immediately think of the curved blade of the Kitbash when they think of Tomb Kings, but smaller swords were also used by their real-world counterparts. In order to attach the Cypher Lord blade, I first needed to clip away and then trim back the axe carried by Helmar. When doing this, you'll want to use the clippers to remove the bulk and then switch out to a knife for the smaller cuts being made closer to the hand. In addition to removing the axe from the hand, it also needed to be removed from the cloth. Again, clipping away the bulk and then making more finer, more controlled cuts with a knife. The Cypher Lord's sword could then be removed from the hand. When you want to retain as much of something as possible, I'd recommend using a knife rather than clippers. The angled blade of many clippers can create a clean cut on one side while slightly crushing the other. After cutting away the blade and the base of the handle from the handle, the cuts were cleaned up to create some flat surfaces. With this done, both of these pieces could be glued into place on Helmar. With the contact points here being quite small, pinning might be tricky, so I'd recommend just using regular glue to avoid damaging the piece with a misaligned drill bit. With Helmar's sword in place, my attention could be turned to his left hand and the shield carried within it. This didn't require too much in the way of modification. The central band looked a little too soul-like Gravelords, so it was removed. When cutting away details from flat surfaces like this, I'd recommend using a knife to make small, controlled cuts in order to remove the bulk of the plastic. Once the majority of the detail has been cleared away, the last few bits can be removed by holding the blade at a steep angle against the surface and employing a scraping motion. This will clear away the raised parts, leaving behind a flat, featureless surface, perfect for having some Tomb King symbol painted onto it later on. The next modification to make to Helmar was to replace his Grave Guard styled helmet with one of the heads from the Cypher Lords kit. Scale wise, the two lined up really nicely, but I couldn't just do a straight head swap here. The Cypher Lord's head is missing the back of the head, so when Helmar's head was clipped away, only the front half was removed. From here, the Cypher Lord's head could have the small eye-shaped trinkets removed from it and then shaved back. These seemed just a little too Tzeentchi for my taste. The rear half of Helmar's head could then be attached to the back of the mask, creating the full head shape. You may have noticed that I tried to keep the multiple parts of Helmar separate so far. Making changes before assembly is not only much easier, but it's also far less likely to break off parts you've already attached. Just make sure that plenty of test fits are made. It's incredibly annoying to find parts not fitting together properly because your new additions are now getting in the way. Once the torso has been glued together, I could check the fit of the helmet, make a few last minute trims as necessary before fixing the head into place and completing Helmar. With Helmar complete, the exact same steps would then be performed on the second shield-wielding member of the Warband, Marshal Falk. His sword was replaced with a Cypher Lord sword, his shield detail was trimmed back, and finally another Cypher Lord head would replace his original. The third and final Graveguard brother would be tackled a little differently though. Thane is armed with a glaive rather than a one-handed weapon, which gave me the perfect opportunity to make use of one of the Cypher Lord's glaive weapons too. But first, the blade of Thane's weapon was removed. Then, the Cypher Lord's weapon was removed from its staff too, where I made sure to retain the tassel as well. After both parts had been cleaned up, they were ready to be attached together, but I refrained from gluing them just yet. After prepping the weapon, the head could be tackled next, and this was done in the exact same way as before. However, after looking at my already built miniatures, I came to the annoyingly late realization that the new heads were looking unusually pristine compared to the shabby look of the rest of the model. So, completely disregarding my earlier advice of making changes before assembling, I went back to my already assembled models and began to chop bits off. By using a combination of my pin vise to drill shallow pockmarks, my clippers to remove larger chunks, and my knife to tidy everything up afterwards, I was then left with some armor that actually looked ancient. If for some reason you decide to repeat my mistake because you just have to follow guides literally, then take care when doing this. If you have more intelligence than I've demonstrated here though, and make all your changes before you glue them, then well done. Have a sticker. After briefly contemplating my hypocrisy, I was finally ready to assemble Thane. The torso pieces were first joined before gluing the weapon into place, resulting in a weapon similar to that carried by the old Ashupti models. Finally, the helmet was added, completing the Dr. Fate fan club. The next member of the Warband to focus on was the big guy known as Sir Jedran Falseborn. The first change to this model was to replace his regular sword for this curved Kitbash style sword, which had been taken from the Scarab Occult kit. The swap began by first removing the Scarab Occult blade from the power armored hand, followed by the removal of Jedran's blade. Both halves were then cleaned up and the edges were flattened out. I could have just glued the new blade to the handle, as had been done with the previous swords, but the larger, more prominently held blade was more likely to get knocked off. To resolve this, and to take advantage of the bulkier blade and handle, I decided to bring in a favourite technique of mine: pinning. 2 1mm holes were carefully drilled into each of the contact surfaces. From here, a length of 1mm thick steel wire was superglued into the hole in the sword before being clipped, so just a few millimeters were left protruding. This exposed wire was then inserted into the hole in the handle, completing the bond. I had, however, gotten a bit carried away here and missed a step. It must have been the excitement to use my pin vise again. I'd forgotten to remove the more techie bits from the blade's edge. These were very carefully shaved back with a scalpel until the surfaces were left flat. The head was the next modification, but instead of completely replacing the head with a Cypher Lord's one, I would simply add the headdress to Jedran's helmet. The headdress was first removed from the Cypher Lord head before being shaved flat. To create a good, strong bond, the headdress would be inserted into the existing helmet. A slot was created by using my saw to make a horizontal cut into the top of the helmet. After the initial cut, the gap was expanded by making a few cuts with the scalpel. During this process, I made frequent comparisons and small adjustments until they were fitting together snugly. Finally, the decorations were trimmed away, the battle damage was added, and the headdress was glued into place. One detail on Jedran that didn't make sense for a desert dweller was the fur draped across his shoulders. It would need to be removed, and the bulk of this was done with clippers. Once things were a little flatter, my knife was then brought in to scrape and steadily shape the plastic into the folds of a ragged fabric. Like with the helmet, this was a steady process, and I took my time to get the desired result. Once it was finished, I then glued together the torso. The final adjustment to be made to Jedran was his shield. Like before, the symbol was first clipped away and shaved flat. To add a little more flair to the shield, I reached for the Phoenix Guard kit. It's an older kit, but it checks out. Within the set are a whole bunch of winged helmets that have a decidedly Egyptian look to them. The wings were removed from the helmet by first using the clippers to separate them and remove the bulk of the excess plastic. My knife was then used to clean up and flatten out the inside surface. Once removed, the bolted edges of the shield were also flattened out before the wings could finally be glued to the sides, completing the shield and Sir Jedran. The final model to tackle was King Morlak Velmon, and the first change was to remove his original sword and replace it with the smaller kitbash blade from the Cypher Lord's kit. This was done by repeating the same steps that had been performed on the first 3 Warband members. The original head is pretty good, but I thought that replacing it with a skeletal bird head would give the model a really cool and unique appearance. It just felt like a great original idea that was in no way inspired by watching Moon Knight. Totally coincidental. Anyway, the head was sourced from a staff found within the Exalted Sorcerer kit, but before I could attach it, I first needed to clip away the original skull. With the human skull removed, the torso could be glued together, allowing me to make a better comparison against the bird skull. After removing the head from the rest of the staff, further cut downs were made until it could be placed into the gap left behind. After making a test fit, I felt that the crown didn't really fit with the theme. The Cypher Lord's headdress would look better and help to tie the model into the rest of the warband. But first, the crown needed to be cut back. Like with Sir Jedran, Velmon was also wearing fur, and this also needed to be removed. Like before, the bulk was clipped away before shaving back in those folds and creases to create that torn cloth effect. Similarly, the headdress was approached in the exact same way. The Cypher Lord head was clipped and shaved back, a notch was added into the head, and after a considerable trimming and adjusting, the head was finally assembled. With Velmon completed, there was just one more step needed to wrap up this kitbash, and that was wrappings. These loose strips of fabric were created with green stuff, and after cutting out and mixing some up, it was rolled out into some long, very thin sausages. In order to flatten these out into strips, I rolled the round handle of a sculpting tool across them, using a light amount of pressure to create the desired shape. Just make sure that you use plenty of Vaseline or water when working with green stuff. It will massively help to reduce the stickiness and make it far easier to work with. With the strips made, these were then laid across and wrapped around the arms, torsos, and legs of every member of the warband. This essentially recreated the partially mummified look of the original Tomb Guard models, but for Velmon I went a little heavier on the wrappings to reflect his higher station. And with that, the miniatures were complete and were ready to be painted. My first step in painting was the primer coat. This important first step creates a better surface for your paint to stick to, but by choosing a particular colour, it also gives you a chance to make applying your scheme a little easier. The colour choice is often down to personal preference or the project you're tackling. Personally, I went with a black primer and applied it with my airbrush. Black primers are great because if you can't quite reach a deep recess or you miss something, they just appear as shadows. When someone questions it, you can just lean back and say it's simply an example of chiaroscuro, being sure in the knowledge that everyone thinks you're a genius. After priming, the first area to tackle were the metallics, and I wanted these to be bronze rather than the typical steel, and so I began with a coat of Pro Acryl's bronze. This paint was thinned out a little on my wet palette before being applied across the blades and armour, with the exception of the helmet and decorative areas. I tried to keep my application neat here, just because painting over metallics with non-metallics can be tricky, but if you do overspill, you can clean up any mistakes with some black paint. Those gold areas were then base coated with another Pro Acryl paint, Rich Gold. Like before, the paint was also thinned out a little before applying a few thin layers to create a good solid metallic surface. After this step, I made sure to change out my paint water to prevent cross-contamination of metal flakes into my other paints. With the metallic base coats applied, the non-metallics could be tackled, with the first of these being the blue cloth. Thousand Suns Blue was the mid-tone that I planned on using, but rather than applying this straight to the model, it was mixed into a little Vorbak red to create a slightly darker, slightly more purple colour. This would create a darker base coat that could be built upon in later steps. Like with the metallics, applying a couple of slightly watered down layers will result in a much smoother finish than applying a single thick coat. This paint was applied over the aforementioned cloth areas, the bands on the headdress, and segments of the shield. For the wooden areas of the model, like the handles and insides of the shield, Corvus Black was used to add a subtle grey tone. The exposed bones were painted with Zendri dust. You may have noticed that most of these base coats are quite dark, but that's just to make the later highlights stand out even more. The leather straps around the waist, armor plates, and the shield were all tackled with the reddish brown of Rhinox hide, whereas the decayed strips of fabric were painted with some Catachan flesh to give them that dirted linen appearance. To help add some contrast against the blue and to also call back to the original Tomb King schemes, some corn red was painted onto alternating strips of the headdresses. In addition to this, the wrappings around the weapon handles and a few cloth trims of Velmorns and Sir Jedran were also tackled with this deep red paint. Finally, a few thin layers of Rakkar flesh were used to paint the other halves of the shields, again referencing some of the original Tomb King artwork. With the base coats completed, a little recessed shading could be created across the models. A layer of Agrax Earthshade was applied across all the bronze, leather, wood, and wrappings. Here it flowed into the recesses and darkened them down to create the appearance of shadows, creating depth and detail in the surfaces. Reikland Flesh Shade was used across the gold details. The slight reddish hue of the wash gave the gold a warmer and rich looking finish, which would help to make it further stand out against the darker bronze. For the bleach bones, the light tan of Seraphim Sepia was chosen. And finally, some Dreckenhof Nightshade was applied across all the blue parts of the miniature. With the washes having taken care of the dark recesses, I could turn my attention to the raised details and edges. Each of these would be painted with a fine line of lighter paint, helping them to stand out even further. The first of these highlights were to the bronze areas. For these, another Pro Acryl paint was applied, this time light bronze. Similarly, for the golden details, I used some bright gold to pick out those edges. After cleaning out my paint water once again, the highlights to the blue cloth could begin. The first of these wasn't so much an edge highlight, but more of a blocking out of the raised areas. Thousand Suns Blue was once again used to paint over the cloth, but the shallow recesses were kept as that earlier applied darker mix. By using thin layers of paint and building them up steadily, it would create a transition between the recesses and the folds in the cloth. With the cloth looking a little lighter overall, the actual edge highlights could begin. The first of these was done using Araman Blue, which was applied to the hard edges, in the same way that metallics had been approached. From here, the even lighter Baharoth Blue was used as an extreme highlight. This type of highlight is reserved for only the sharpest points of the edges, or where a couple of edges converge to create a more defined crease. Applying small spots of this light blue paint to these points makes them appear even more defined. For the next batch of highlights, I wanted to try and keep down the number of paints that was being used to a minimum. So for each highlight, I took the original base coat and mixed it into some Screaming Skull in 2 different amounts, creating 2 progressively lighter versions of the original paint. The darker of these 2 was used as the regular highlight, whereas the lighter of the 2 was applied as an extreme highlight. So for the first mix, some Screaming Skull was mixed into Corvus Black and then applied over those wooden areas. The bones were first tackled with a Zendri Dust and Screaming Skull mixture for the first highlight, but when it came to the extreme highlight, I just used the Screaming Skull on its own. And so, for the next few highlights, I simply followed that same process of mixing Screaming Skull in different amounts into that original base colour. This approach not only helped to keep the numbers of required paints down, but it also helped to give the surfaces more of a faded, almost bleached appearance. Something that is perfect for representing some desert-dwelling undead who've been baked under a scorching sun. You could use a white or a pale yellow for this instead, with white mixes looking even more washed out and yellow mixtures retaining a little more warmth. With the highlights completed, there was just one final detail to add to the miniature, and that was some symbols on the Rakkar flesh areas of the shield. These designs were taken from the old Tomb King's painting guide and were carefully applied using some Mephiston red. With the models complete, my attention could be turned to the bases. It made the most sense to tackle them in a desert theme, so the stone slabs and steps were painted with a few thin layers of Morghast bone. Once a good solid base colour had been achieved, the details strewn across the base could be painted, and these were simply painted with the same colours that I'd used on other areas of the miniatures. For a desert environment, the bases were looking decidedly lacking in sand. It's coarse, it's rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere, including my warband. So to fix this, I took some of AK's sandy desert texture paste and applied it on and around the details on the base, laying it up in some areas to create small piles. With everything having been base coated and dried, those recesses could be darkened down with a liberal wash of Seraphim Sepia. While I was waiting for the washes to fully dry, I cleaned up the rims of the bases with some Abaddon Black. After everything had dried, the varnish could be applied. This would serve a couple of uses. First, it would protect the paintwork and prevent it from being damaged during games, and it would also help to tone down any overt glossiness that the washes had created. I chose Storm Shield for this and applied it via my airbrush, but feel free to use whatever matte or satin varnish that you have access to. But there was still one step left. To give the base that dusty desert look, I chose to apply some pigment. This light tan powder was simply dusted across the base and around the lower legs with a regular old brush. Here it accumulated into some of the recesses, but also settled onto those flatter surfaces. The result was more of that dusty texture that I was looking to create. And with that, the warband was complete. And here we have the completed Tomb King's warband built from the Sons of Velmorn. When I first started playing Warhammer Fantasy, I was never really into the Tomb Kings, but since their disappearance after the end times, it's become a miniature range I'd love to see back on shelves. Fortunately, they do appear to be getting a refresh when the old world arrives, but until then, I'm happy with my Tomb King inspired Underworlds warband. Like I mentioned before, I specifically wanted to limit my choice of parts to only those that can still be purchased, rather than relying on overpriced Tomb Kings kits found on eBay. I think I managed to achieve that, with the Cypher Lord's kit doing an awful lot of the heavy lifting here. It was also nice to convert a warband. This and Warcry are probably the closest Age of Sigmar has to Kill Team, and I really enjoy those more focused builds. It makes it much more achievable, both in time and money, to convert 5 models rather than trying to replicate the results across a whole army. So if you have any ideas for other warbands I could try, let me know in the comments below. Now before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jack Ewan, Jonathan Hart, Tim, Brushlick and Nim, Daniel Dowling, Jesse Smith, Joachim Folk, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. If you are interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye. Quick note, whilst editing this, I did remember that I probably should have renamed the members of the warband to better represent their Tomb King inspiration. Fortunately, I recently watched a really good documentary about Egyptian mythology, so I'm just going to pull a few names from that. So, here we have Aksunamun, Imhotep, Ardeth, Jonathan, and Rick O'Connell. So yeah, there you go. A few of you also said that in my last video, there was too much stuff cluttering up the screen here, so there you go. An extra long outro to hopefully give you a good, unobstructed look at the finished models. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.